Tonight at 10, the government overhauls its COVID rules, simplifying travel to England. Only those returning from red list countries now need an expensive PCR test or quarantine, while the amber list of countries has been scrapped. But there are concerns the changes mean fewer opportunities to screen for possible COVID variants. Also tonight, after Australia, the US and Britain agree a new security partnership, France recalls its ambassadors to Washington and Canberra. The Pentagon admits one of its drone strikes killed 10 civilians in Kabul, including 7 children. The transgender teenager given drugs to pause puberty. Now judges say doctors were right to offer the treatment. And it's a goal fest for the home nations in tonight's Women's World Cup qualifiers. 20 in all.
Coming up in sport on the BBC News Channel, England get off to a winning start under Serena Wiegman, hammering North Macedonia in the World Cup qualifiers. Victories too for Wales, Scotland and Northern Ireland.
Good evening. The government has announced major changes to the COVID rules for travellers entering England. From October the 4th, you'll no longer have to take a lateral flow test before heading home if you're double vaccinated. And from the end of October, you won't need an expensive PCR test on return if fully vaccinated. Instead, a lateral flow test must now be done within 2 days of arrival. Travellers from 17 more countries who've been double jabbed using vaccines approved for use in the UK will also now be exempt from quarantine. The government has also scrapped the traffic light system for travel rules. Countries will now either be open for travel or on a red list. Those returning from red countries will still have to quarantine in designated hotels. Now, the changes only apply to England at the moment. In Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, the devolved administrations are in charge of their own travel rules. Here's our transport correspondent, Caroline Davies.
Travel has meant testing. Across the country, centres like these have popped up to swab passengers, but things are about to change. Throughout the summer, the travel industry and the government have disagreed about the use of these PCR tests for all travellers when they arrive in the UK. The government has always argued that this is necessary to be able to identify variants of concern, but the travel industry say it's a barrier and too expensive. Before the end of October, if you're double jabbed, PCR tests are going to be replaced by the cheaper lateral flow tests. If you test positive, you will need to have a PCR test and isolate at home. It's a relief for hotels who've struggled as families have stayed away because of the added cost.
The UK market has dropped between 50 and 70% depending on the travelling month, especially if family is hard hit by the restrictions implemented and the traffic light system, which obviously every 3 weeks is sort of like a surprise what's going to happen. So we definitely believe that this change is going to boost sales massively.
It's not the only change. From the 4th of October, fully vaccinated travellers will also no longer need to take a lateral flow test before they travel. Under 18s will also avoid this test. They're treated as vaccinated adults. If you're not double jabbed, it's very different. You'll need to test before you travel and self-isolate at home for 10 days after every international trip, as well as pay for PCR tests. For the industry, this change can't come soon enough.
Very pleased with the announcement. Just what we wanted to hear. I think the government has been listening to the industry. We've been interacting with them for some time. It's a great piece of news for us. It will give our customers the end of summer they deserve, abroad in the sun. So yes, we welcome the announcement.
But not everyone in the scientific community agrees that PCR tests should be removed.
I would like to see PCR tests remain because they've given us so much information already from the sequencing. So we know when Delta was introduced into the UK, when the Delta variant came in, that this virus was imported over 500 times. And we wouldn't have that information if we weren't doing the screening and the sequencing that's associated with that.
After months of insisting PCR tests were needed, why has the government changed its mind now?
The judgment of the scientists, of the experts, was that it would have been too soon without having the numbers of people vaccinated, not just at home, where, of course, we had this very fast vaccination program, but critically abroad as well, at a level whereby, we can now say with a lot of confidence, not only are 9 out of 10 adults vaccinated here, but abroad also they've caught up with the very high numbers that we saw earlier.
And for those with loved ones in some red list countries, there was good news. Harum hasn't seen his family in Pakistan for more than 3 years. From next Wednesday, it's off the red list, along with 7 other countries.
Since this news, I'm feeling really, really relieved, and it's just like the pressure off the shoulders now. On top of the list right now, that I want to go home and just give my mum and dad a hug and just tell them everything is okay. We're all right now.
The summer may be drawing to a close, but today's announcement has given the industry some hope. For now, they're enjoying this moment in the sun.
And Caroline, how are the other home nations responding to England's move?
Well, they're not automatically following the same path. So Wales and Scotland have said that they will do the same things with the red list countries. But in terms of the rest of it, that's still up for play. Wales says that they are still considering it, and Scotland has said that it will still require people to have a pre-departure test, and that at the moment they are not getting rid of PCR tests at this stage either. We haven't heard from Northern Ireland. Now, the industry are pleased by these announcements, but of course there is now this niggle about PCR tests, both when they will be removed for people who are travelling into England. The government has said that that should happen before the end of October, and it's key that that happens for the industry before the half-term holidays. But of course, if the other countries follow suit. So they really do want to make sure that that measure doesn't slip and that the rest of the UK follows suit.
Sure. OK, Caroline, thank you. Caroline Davies there. And the Welsh Government has announced tighter COVID rules for people attending mass events. You'll need proof of vaccinations or a negative COVID test. The new controls come into force next month for venues like clubs and at sporting events. Here's our Wales correspondent, Howell Griffith.
Thou shalt not pass unless you've got one of these. Not the Welsh Government insists a vaccine passport, but proof of either being jabbed or a negative lateral flow test. Mandatory COVID passes haven't been welcomed by the hospitality industry. At this nightclub, they'll say they'll comply if it means avoiding another lockdown.
It's not ideal, but these are not ideal times. People come to the club, we already check their ID, we search everyone. Having them show a COVID pass, it's not a big problem.
So you'll go with it just to stay open?
Yes.
Football and rugby stadiums will check for passes too, but the whole system depends on people taking tests, reporting their own results. The First Minister warns giving fake information could become an offence.
Who on earth would check someone's lateral flow test result?
Well, people do it now. And so it is possible for the system to be properly policed. But that isn't the purpose of the system. The purpose of the system is to help to keep Wales safe and keep Wales open. And the vast majority of people in Wales want to play their part in doing that.
Safeguards like having to wear masks in shops and telling people to work from home were kept in place in Wales over the summer, but they failed to stop the spread of the virus. Now pressure's being felt once again in hospitals.
Emergency wards across Wales say they are already stretched. Some intensive care patients are being moved between hospitals. Here in Cardiff, they say most of their new COVID patients are unvaccinated.
I mean, it makes me angry and it makes me upset. And that is because I'm seeing these people at their worst. And they're often in tears, or the family are in tears, going, I wish I'd done it. Or, is it too late for me now to have it? And unfortunately, by the time you are that sick with COVID, it is too late.
What's the latest from that on the family?
Whether making passes mandatory will prove to be a remedy may take months to discern. The new rules come into force on October the 11th. Howell Griffith, BBC News, Cardiff.
The government's latest coronavirus figures show there were 32,651 new infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. That means in the last week there was an average of 29,476 new cases per day. There were 8,068 people in hospital as of yesterday. That's across the UK. 178 deaths were reported in the latest 24-hour period. That's of people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test, which means the average number of deaths per day in the last week is now 142. 89.3% of people aged 16 and over have had their first jab, and 81.5% are now double vaccinated. In an unprecedented diplomatic move, France has recalled its ambassadors to America and Australia. It follows this week's surprise announcement of a new security and defence pact between the US, the Australians and the UK. The move, which took the French, a NATO ally, by surprise, also saw Australia rip up an agreement to buy submarine technology from France. Well, our North America editor John Sopel is live in Washington for us. John, the French, not consulted about this trilateral agreement, now expressing extreme irritation, to say the least.
To say the very least, Clive. It is an extraordinary and, I would say, unprecedented move for the French to recall their ambassador from the United States. You almost need to say it twice to believe it, because France and America are very close allies, and I think it's the first time in the history of the relationship between France and the US that this has happened. And the anger is on two levels. As you say, the loss of this $60 billion contract that the French hoped they would be selling submarines to Australia, but also the fact that it was done behind their back has aggrieved their sense of kind of dignity that this has happened. Joe Biden came into power with this kind of reputation that it was going to be competent government that he was going to run. They seem to have badly misjudged this in terms of the French reaction. But Clive, you and I were Paris correspondents many moons ago, and it would be negligent not to point out that next spring there is a French presidential election. Emmanuel Macron has ordered this and has no doubt calculated that France, standing up to its big, powerful ally, might be quite popular among the French. He's trying to make the worst of a very bad situation. But this row has grown at an exponential speed.
OK, John, thank you. John Sopel there live in Washington. An NHS trust has won its appeal to overturn a landmark ruling on the use of puberty-blocking drugs for children. Last year, the High Court said it was highly unlikely that a child aged 13 or under would be able to consent to hormone-blocking treatment, and it was very doubtful that a child of 14 or 15 would understand the long-term consequences. But now the Court of Appeal has ruled in favour of the Tavistock and Portman NHS Foundation Trust, which runs the UK's only gender identity development service for children, with the judges saying it's up to doctors to exercise their judgment on patient consent. With more, here's Alison Holt.
Kira Bell's experience of how teenage decisions shaped her life led to the original court case. At 16, desperate to transition from female to male, she was prescribed drugs to delay puberty, then male hormones. Now in her 20s, she believes it was a mistake. Last year, she told me she should have been challenged more.
The discussions were very brief and there was no real investigation into why I had gender dysphoric feelings and how I got to that stage. I spoke briefly of depression and anxiety, but again, it was kind of assumed by everyone that transitioning would alleviate that.
She was treated here at the Tavistock, the UK's only gender identity clinic for children. Last December, the High Court ruled that someone under 16 could not fully understand the implications of taking puberty blockers, so the NHS stopped prescribing them to younger people. Overturning that, today's Court of Appeal judgment found the High Court was not in a position to give guidance that generalised about the capability of persons of different ages, concluding that it placed patients, parents and clinicians in a difficult position and should not have been given.
We're really pleased about this judgment.
The Tavistock's chief executive says that means they can once again send young people worried about their gender identity for puberty blocker treatment after careful checks and discussion.
At the heart of that is respecting what young people know about their own minds, their own bodies, and I think that's a really important principle. With all the clinical safeguards that you need in cases of this kind, but respecting the autonomy of young people at the same time, working obviously with their parents and families.
Kira Bell's lawyer says they are disappointed by the ruling, but he believes the case has already ensured much more scrutiny of these life-altering decisions.
The case has been
hugely significant in terms of medical treatment for children with gender dysphoria, and not only in this country, but around the world. In this country, the NHS has updated its advice on the reversibility of puberty blockers. An extra layer of protection has been put in place for children who are receiving treatment at the Tavistock.
But these arguments are unlikely to be over. Kira and her legal team say they hope to challenge today's ruling in the Supreme Court. Alison Holt, BBC News.
A judge in America has ruled that lawyers for Virginia Giuffre, the woman who's accused Prince Andrew of sexual assault, will be able to serve legal papers on his representative in America. It follows a dispute over whether the prince had been formally notified of the civil claim against him. The Duke of York has always denied any wrongdoing. Our royal correspondent Johnny Diamond is here, so brings up to date where we are with the legal standing in all this.
Well, Clive, it's been a week of legal manoeuvring, as most of it centred on this issue of getting the allegations in paper form into the hands of either Prince Andrew or his lawyers. On Monday, the lawyers went head-to-head in New York, trying to work out whether these papers have been properly served. On Wednesday, the High Court here said it would assist the lawyers for Virginia Giuffre, who has accused Prince Andrew of sexual assault, something he's always denied, assist them in getting the papers properly served. And now this judge in New York has said that the papers can be served on a US lawyer for Prince Andrew. And that means this case will almost certainly go ahead. That lawyer says that because of a deal Virginia Giuffre struck with Jeffrey Epstein, in 2009, this case may well be null and void. But that deal is secret, it's sealed, and only when the case goes ahead can we actually find out whether or not it might be opened.
Sure, OK. Johnny, thank you. Johnny Diamond. The Pentagon has admitted that a US drone strike carried out in Kabul in the days before US troops pulled out of Afghanistan killed 10 innocent civilians, including 7 children. The victims were an aid worker and 9 members of his family. Well, Secunda Kamani is in the Afghan capital, Kabul, for us tonight. Secunda, you actually saw the aftermath of that drone strike, didn't you?
That's right, Clive. We were there the morning after the strike, and it was a terrible scene. Family members combing through the wreckage, searching for remains of their loved ones so they could try and bury them. They were, of course, utterly distraught, also furious at the suggestion they had anything to do with ISIS. In fact, a number of those family members who were killed had worked with, as you say, American aid organizations, American forces even in Afghanistan. The family had been hoping to be evacuated out to America. This is an incredibly grim way to bring an end to this chapter of American involvement in Afghanistan. Meanwhile, here there's a deepening economic crisis, also increasing concern about whether the Taliban will respect women's rights or not. They seem to have today replaced the Women Affairs Ministry with a ministry for the promotion of virtue and prevention of vice that has a very notorious reputation from their previous stint in power. At the same time, the Taliban seem to be reaching out to a number of former government employees, trying to encourage them to come back to work. Here's our report, filmed by my colleague cameraman Malik Mudassar in the northern city of Mazar-e Sharif. Lifting off, the Taliban's new air force. On board, their fighters. In the cockpit, their former enemies, pilots from the previous government. The fleet, now under the Taliban's control, includes fighter planes, originally donated by America. Dozens of pilots fled abroad as the Taliban took over, in fear of their lives, taking their aircraft with them. These helicopters launched a lot of attacks against the Taliban. That's right, isn't it? But as the group announced an amnesty, others decided to stay on.
Has never flown before?
You're both sitting here very calmly, but do you recognise that it's quite a strange situation for two people who were trying to kill each other now to be working together?
Afghanistan فتح د افغانستان ازادي دا مزړه کې تیرېدل خو داسې چې سبب بیرته بیا موږ د دې خلکو سره ناست یاستو بیا به خدمت سره کوو نو دا مو هم زړه ته ولیده ځکه چې موږ پوهیږو چې دا موږ خپل د وطن خلک دي.
این یک روز آمدنی بود حتما. این نبود که مثال بگویم که والا تا ابد اینا به یک جنا میرن و ما به دیگه جنا میریم.
Elsewhere, the political transition is far less smooth. Foreign reserves are frozen as the international community weighs up how to support Afghans, but not the Taliban. Banks have restricted cash withdrawals. Second-hand markets have sprung up across the country. The war might have come to an end, but this is where you see the utter desperation that so many Afghans are living in right now. Most of this market didn't even exist a month ago. Now it's full of people trying to sell whatever household possessions they can just to put food on the table for their families.
اینمی کالای محفلی اولادا کوین بود کالای تویشان دیگه کالای جل بود دیگه کی میخره و اینمی کالای نوشانه کشیدم گفتم باش کمیره بفروشم به قیمت خوب سرداشه و کار روغن برنج بگیریم یک 5 تا نون بگیریم.
Most public sector employees weren't even paid their salaries in the last months of the previous government. Now they have no idea when or if they will be paid again. You were still working but you didn't get salary? This teacher has already sold whatever she can.
The
transition of power in Afghanistan was much less bloody than many had feared. But half the country was already in dire need, and the struggle to survive is becoming even harder. Sikandar Kamani, BBC News, Mazar-e Sharif.
2 men have appeared in court charged with the murder of the journalist Lyra McKee in Londonderry. The 29-year-old was shot dead by a gunman from the dissident Republican group, the New IRA, in April 2019. Both men were also charged with possession of a firearm and ammunition with intent to endanger life. They were released on bail. The new Housing Secretary, Michael Gove, has decided to pause controversial government planning reforms in England. It's understood he wants talks with Conservative MPs who voiced their concerns about the proposals. The government has pledged to build 300,000 new homes a year. Now, the United Nations says failure to cut greenhouse gas emissions is setting the world on a catastrophic path of global warming. UN scientists have studied the climate plans of more than 100 countries and say pledges made to curb emissions won't meet the ambitions of the Paris Climate Change Agreement signed in 2015. Millions living in Kenya are already having to adapt to more severe droughts and less intense rainy seasons. As delegates prepare for next month's UN Climate Change Summit in Glasgow, our Africa correspondent Vivienne Nunes reports now on Kenya's struggles against global warming.
On the front line of climate change, a 7-hour trek brings something to drink. This grandmother is part of the Turkana community, a million people who've lived off this land for centuries. Life here has never been easy, but recent droughts have robbed these pastoralists of water, livestock and vegetation. Now they're fighting to keep the only life they've ever known.
The climate has changed. We don't get water from underground anymore because the wells are dried. I had a number of goats, but the drought hit them. I have nothing left.
Yet another desperate search where water used to be.
Not that long ago, this dam was an important water source for local villagers and their livestock. On any given day, you would see cattle, sheep and goats here. But as the rainy seasons became ever shorter and drier, this dam completely dried up, forcing local communities to walk further and further to find water to survive.
Livelihoods here are intrinsically linked to the local environment. Droughts used to hit Turkana every 10 years, but in the 1990s the frequency doubled, and since 2017 drought conditions have struck Turkana every second year. Flash flooding can also strike here, with the power to wipe out entire herds. Extreme weather events mean food shortages, rising poverty and insecurity.
When the drought came, it brought new animal diseases, and we lost many animals. Now children go hungry because there's no milk.
Some herders say they're left with no choice but to travel long distances in search of food. Sometimes that means crossing borders where livestock are stolen and violent conflict ensues. The people here did little to cause climate change, but they're bearing the brunt of it.
We cannot mitigate. Mitigate requires technology, but we can just adapt. But you see, because of these effects of climate change, which are increasing day in, day out, it is going out of our hands.
A donated water pump brings this community some relief, but it won't bring the rains that people here so desperately need. Vivienne Nunes, BBC News, Turkana.
All 4 home nations have been playing qualifying matches for the Women's Football World Cup in 2023. England, under a new manager, were easy 8-0 winners over North Macedonia. And there were plenty of goals for Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland too. Here's Joe Corrie.
New manager comes in, players are keen to impress, and England's Lionesses wouldn't get a better opportunity to show what they could do than when facing North Macedonia, a team ranked 131 in the world. And they got off to the perfect start. Leah Williamson with an inch-perfect ball, Ella Toone slotting home to become the first England player to score under Serena Wiegman. England took their time adding a second, but this time Toone turned provider, scrapping, finding Ellen White, who wouldn't miss from there. Before the visitors added an unfortunate own goal before half-time.
Look at that ball in, a goalkeeper missed it, and an own goal. Christina.
After the break, England kept at the pressure. The chasm in quality between the two sides never more obvious than when North Macedonia kicked the ball into the back of their own net for a second time. Substitute Beth England shone in the second half, adding 2 goals, the pick of which was this unstoppable header, before Beth Mead wrapped up proceedings and an 8-0 win.
So Serena Wiegman's time as England manager gets off to an impressive start. Meanwhile, elsewhere tonight, the other home nations were also enjoying winning starts to their World Cup qualifying campaigns.
What a pass. Wales were dominant against Kazakhstan, some sublime passing helped by some inept interceptions. Kaylee Green with a pick of the goals, she went on to score again in a comfortable 6-0 win. Top scorer Rachel Furness was on fire for Northern Ireland. This bullet header part of an outstanding performance that saw them beat Luxembourg 4-0. Scotland, though, didn't have it so easy in Hungary, but when Erin Cuthbert was sent tumbling in the box, she picked herself up and converted the penalty. Well, eventually, showing the value of being able to use both feet as Scotland ground out a 2-0 win. Joe Corrie, BBC News, Southampton.
That's it. Now on BBC One, time for the news where you are. Have a very good night.